Hello, my name is Brant Hunt, and today is Friday, the 30th day of July 2021. And what I'm going to do tonight is, I have what I call personal heroes, although they're not personal heroes. They are heroes that stood against the system. And I've spoken to you last night with Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was a Russian, a writer who had a great impact upon the Soviet Union collapse. He also experienced what I would call living in the gulags. Gulags were what I would call simply a prison system. Even though he only spoke out against the system that was involved, he was actually at the front, and he wrote a letter and got caught. So he was put in prison for many years. So tonight I want to talk to you about an American hero that most Americans don't know who he is. And it's strictly, a lot of this is for young people out there who want to know the truth, because that's what I'm about. I'm interested in truth. And that means on the spiritual level, that means in the past, that means in history, like I said, and also religion and how it's fooled people, and how lawyers are in cahoots with the bankers, you see. So let's start here. This took place on June the 10th, 1932. And Louis McFadden is a gentleman from Pennsylvania, and he was the ranking member of the House Banking Committee. So he was a senior guy there. Okay, so let's get involved here. It starts from a quote from Henry Ford. "It is well enough that the people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system. For if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning." There would be a revolution tomorrow morning, you see, in what they've done to us. You see, they've stolen everything from you, folks, and made you slaves so many ways. And they think it's funny. I don't. So here we go. "Mr. Chairman, at the present session of Congress, we have been dealing with emergency situations." This is how they always do this in the banking system, over and over. That's how they've. It's emergency. We got a trouble. But this is the same thing they did in 2001. Oh, we got to do something. We got to take away people's freedom, such and such. They do this all the time, folks. It's a way for them to steal even what little freedoms you do have. "We have been dealing with the effect of things rather than with the cause of things." Was true. This is what they do. They never get to the root. Never do. Let me just say this real quick. If you're a lawyer, I'd be ashamed to be a lawyer. If you're not pushing national law, you're against everything that is what I would call holy and sacred. Period. And I come across maybe here a little angry, but the point simply is, you need to understand, you lawyers out there who are just stealing from people. You steal and you justify it. You see, you don't even understand you belong to a bar that actually is a British bar. Meaning it simply is, this has nothing to do with the ABA. The power is actually started with the British. You see, so you're not even serving your own country here. But neither's Britain. They idolize the Pope. You see, these guys do, and the King. I've never seen people who worship a king and a queen as the people in Britain. They follow her around like she doesn't stink. I mean, it's just amazing what you see and how people are caught up in that, and they just think it's so great. You see, people like to live in their fairy tale world, folks. So, back to the problem. There are underlying principles which are responsible for conditions such as we have at the present time, and I shall deal with one of those in particular, which is tremendously important in the consideration that you are now giving to this bill. Now, let me explain something to you folks. It takes a lot of guts to do this. Do you understand that? It takes guts not only to vote against what they're trying to propose, but actually speak against it. And it's in the congressional record, you see. Mr. Chairman, we have in this country one of the most corrupt institutions the world has ever known. I refer to the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve Banks. The Federal Reserve Board, a government board, has cheated the government of the United States and the people of the United States out of enough money to pay the national debt. That was in 1932, folks. Now think of what they've done since then. You know, they've taken us off the gold and silver, which is, this is going to take place right here. They tax you, and they made you collateral. You're the collateral, folks, because the country's been bankrupt. Let's see, get back. The appreciations and inquiries of the Federal Reserve Board has cost this country enough money to pay the national debt several times over. This evil institution has impoverished and ruined the people of the United States, has bankrupt itself, and has practically bankrupted our government. It has done this through the defects of the law under which it operates, through the maladministration of the law by the Federal Reserve Board, and through the corrupt practices of money vultures who control it. Some people think the Federal Reserve Banks are a United States government institution. They are not government institutions at all. They are private credit monopolies which prey upon the people of the United States for their benefits of themselves and their foreign customers, foreign and domestic speculators and swindlers and rich and predator moneylenders. In that dark crew of financial pirates, there are those who would cut a man's throat to get a dollar out of his pocket. There are those who send money into the states to buy votes to control our legislation. Yeah, sure have. Been doing that for a long time. And there are those who maintain international propaganda for the purpose of deceiving us and wheeling us into the granting of a new concession which will permit them to cover up their past misdeeds, set again in motion their gigantic train of crime. Now, let me explain some things here. I'm jumping off here as I was looking at something yesterday. I'm looking around me, and I'm looking at the population increase in this country from 180 million in 1960 to 330 million. That's what they call it. Where are the jobs? You see, there were plenty of jobs for 180 million people. You see, now most of those were kids and moms, but there were jobs for good paying jobs at that point. We're talking about the 50s, the 40s during the war. But let's go to the other point here. There aren't any jobs here, folks. They're not good paying jobs. And the money isn't worth anything. And you're going to discover that. It's already happening. Inflation's already happening. Inflation is not what you think it is. It's a depreciation of what the dollar value is. That's why it skyrockets and it's worth less and less, because you go somewhere and you, like for me, like for example, I get a haircut and it was, 2 or 3 months ago, $14, and it's now $18, almost a 30% increase. Now I didn't pay 18. I said something. I went, $16. But the point simply is, they were charging $18 to other people. The only reason why they did it with me was because my age. I'm older. But anyway, these 12 private credit monopolies were deceitful and disloyal, fostered upon the country by the bankers who came here from Europe and repaid us for our hospitality by undermining our American institutions. Those bankers took money out of this country to finance Japan in a war against Russia. Yes, they did. They sure did. They gave money for Japan during the trying to overthrow the Tsar. All this connects, folks. The Tsar in the revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, right before that time, in order to weaken the Russian defense military. This is not a joke, folks. They do all this stuff and they plan it out. And so they paid Japan to do this, gave them loans. And they actually won the war. Japan beat Russia. I think this was in 1905. Don't hold me to that. That's where my mind says 1905. They created a reign of terror in Russia with our money in order to help that war along. They instigated the separate peace between Germany and Russia and thus drove a wedge between the allies of the World War. They financed Trotsky's passage from New York to Russia. You bet you they did. And even they were stopped by the Canadians. They were stopped by the Canadian Navy and corresponded with Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson, which was a part of his whole swindler, as he was, the worst fucking president ever, because he was a traitor. I'm sorry if you don't like the word fucking, you need to get upset and see what's going on, folks. And especially you young people out here, you're in big time trouble because you don't have anything anymore. You see, you don't have anything to hold on to. That's why most of you are having to live with your parents when you're 30 years old. And there's no hope in sight to having a decent job. And then the problem is simply is you borrow money to go to college and you're in debt and you never can find a decent job. So you're in worse shape ever before. They fomented and instigated the Russian Revolution, and they placed a large fund of American dollars at Trotsky's disposal in one of their branch banks in Sweden, so that through him, Russia's home might be thoroughly broken up and Russia's children flung far and wide from their natural protectors. They have since began the breaking up of American homes and dispersal of American children. Yeah, they've been doing that too here after this, especially in the 50s and 60s, laying the groundwork. And eventually you see how the situation here is in America with families. It has been said that President Wilson was deceived by the attention of these bankers and by the philanthropic pose they assumed. It has been said that when he discovered the manner in which he had been misled by Colonel House, he turned against that busybody, that holy monk of the financial empire, and showed him the door. Well, whoopie-doo, it was a little late, isn't it? He had the grace to do that. In my opinion, he deserves great credit for it. Well, I don't know if he did it or not. I really don't. In my opinion, he was a scoundrel. He was a traitor. So anyway, Colonel House was President Wilson's confidant, similar to President Nixon with Kissinger. And with Carter, I'm trying to think who it was. I don't know if it was Kissinger or not, but I know that Nixon depended upon Kissinger enormously, which was another traitor. President Wilson died a victim of deception. When he came to the presidency, he had certain qualities of mind and heart which entitled him to a high place in the Council of the Nations. But there was one thing he was not, and which he never aspired to be. He was not a banker. He said that he knew very little about banking. It was therefore, that was probably the reason why they wanted him to be president, you see. On the advice of others, that the iniquitous Federal Reserve Act, the death warrant of American liberty, became law in his administration. Mr. Chairman, there should be no partisanship in matters concerning the banking and currency affair of this country. And I do not speak with any. Sorry, I'm turning the page here. In 1912, the National Monetary Association, under the chairmanship of the late Senator Nelson W. Aldrich, which was another traitor from the state of New Jersey, made a report and presented a vigorous bill called the National Reserve Association Bill. This bill is unusual. It's usually spoken of Aldrich's bill. Senator Aldrich did not write the Aldrich bill. Of course he did. He was just a tool. But not the accomplice of the European-born bankers who for nearly 20 years have been scheming to set up a central bank in the country and who in 1912 had spent and were continuing to spend vast sums of money to accomplish this purpose. The Aldrich Bridge was condemned on the platform upon which Theodore Roosevelt was nominated in the year 1912. And in that same year, Woodrow Wilson was nominated. The Democratic platform, as adopted at the Baltimore Convention, expressly noted, "We're opposed to the Aldrich for a central bank." This was plain language. The men who ruled the Democratic Party then promised to people that if they were returned power, there would be no central bank established here while they held their reins of government. Well, we know how politicians are. They lie. They always do. 13 months later, that promise was broken, and the Wilson administration, under the tutelage of the Senator Wall Street figures who stood behind Colonel House, established here in our free country the worm-eating monarchy institution of the King's Bank. To control us from the top downward and to shackle us from the cradle to the grave, the Federal Reserve Act destroyed our own and characteristic ways of doing business. It discriminated against our one-name commercial paper, the finest in the world. It set up the antiquely two-name paper, which is the present curse of the country, and which wrecked every country which has ever given it scope. It fastened down upon the country the very tyranny from which the framers of the Constitution sought to save us. And so what is he's speaking of simply is they spent money, tons of money, to get this to work. They were determined to do this. They were determined to, because see, they hadn't had that deal, and there was already speculation that this was already they were going to try to do this. See, and they were determined to do this, and they did it. They did it late at night on the Christmas holidays. You see, that's what they did. They had a quorum. A quorum. You heard me. A quorum. A quorum is just a few people being there. Period. So what we're talking about, which is, and I want to share this screen with you, so you can understand how this fits and how it fits, because I have read this book. And I want to share this with you here. So here, hold on a second. So this is G. Edward Griffin. He's the author. He's written some excellent books. And what I want to share with you simply is that this particular book here, The Creature from Jekyll Island, is where they met in secrecy to actually plan this whole idea. And this was at first called the Aldrich Plan. It was defeated at first, and then it was later on they met, like I said, at a quorum. Only no one was there hardly. At night, all those are red flags, folks, at night. And what happened was simply is they passed it, you see. So I just thought I'd share that with you. He also has written books on the issue of cancer, the item what we would call Laetrile, which is B17. It is a way of actually curing your cancer. It's to do with what we call basically the B17 is in apricots, the seeds of apricot. In fact, all seeds of fruit have important minerals and vitamins in it. And that's why most of the fruit nowadays, they don't have seeds in the fruit, because you no longer can eat it, you see. I mean, you can't plant it, one thing. And two is simply you can't eat it because they don't have the seeds there anymore. So that's the sad situation it is today. So I just thought I'd share that with you, who G. Edward Griffin is. He's an elderly man now. I don't know how long he's going to live, but I just thought I'd share that with you about who he is. So here we go, back to me. So see if I can get back to where I was at. One of the greatest battles for the preservation of this republic was fought out here in Jackson's day, when the second bank in the United States, which was founded upon the same false principle as those who are here and simplified in the Federal Reserve Act, was hurled out of existence. After the downfall of the second bank in the United States in 1837. The country was warned against the dangers that might ensue if the predator interests, after being cast out, should come back in disguise and unite themselves in the executive, and through him acquire control of the government. That is what the predator interests did when they came back in the library of hypocrisy and other false pretenses, attained the passage of the Federal Reserve Act. All these things were leading to what we would call, even the war between the states was to eliminate the power of the state and give it to the central government, that being the government in Washington. It's been a constant deal because this is what they wanted. That's how they destroy a country, is to eliminate their money that is backed by gold and silver. These people, Bernanke, all these guys here, act like they are really shrewd businessmen. They're just flunkies. They're just speaking what they know. And a lot of it simply is they know something. Don't get me wrong. But the point simply are they're lackeys and flunkies for the bankers. They're your enemy, folks. The danger that the country was warned against crime came upon us, as shown in a long train of horrors attendant upon the affairs of the traitorous and dishonest Federal Reserve Board, and the Federal Reserve banks are fully liable. This is an era of financial crime, and in the financing of crime, the Federal Reserve Board does not play the part of a disinterested spectator. It's been said that the draftsman who was employed to write the text of the Federal Reserve Bill used a text of Aldrich's Bill for his purpose. It has been said that this language of Aldrich's Bill was used because the Aldrich Bill had been drawn up by expert lawyers. There's those demons. You hear me? And seemed to be appropriate. It was indeed drawn up by the lawyers. The Aldrich Bill was created by acceptance bankers of European origin in New York City. It was a copy and, in general, a translation of the statutes of the Reichsbank and other European central banks. $500,000 was spent, one part of the propaganda organized by some European bankers for the purpose of misleading public opinion in regard to it, and for the purpose of giving Congress the impression that there was an overwhelming popular demand for that kind of banking legislation and that kind of currency that goes with it, namely an asset currency based on human debts and obligations instead of an honest currency based on gold and silver values. Dr. H. Parker Willis has been employed by the Wall Street bankers and propagandists, and when Aldrich's measure came to naught and he attained employment with the Carter Glass to assist in drawing a banking bill for the Wilson administration, he appropriated the text of Aldrich's bill for his purpose. There's no secret about it. The text of the Federal Reserve Act was tainted from the beginning. Not all the Democrat members of the 63rd Congress voted for this great deception. Some of them, remembering the teaching of Jefferson, and through the years, there had been no criticism of the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve Bank, so honest, so outspoken, and so unsparingly as though which has been voiced here by Democrats. Again, although a number of Republicans voted for the Federal Reserve Act, it was as the most conservative member of the Republican Party would have nothing to do with it and voted against it. A few days before the bill came to a vote, Senator Henry Lodge of Massachusetts wrote to Senator John A. Weeks as following: "Throughout my public life, I have supported all measures designed to take the government out of the banking business. This bill puts the government into the banking business as never before in our history, and makes, as I understand it, all notes government notes when they should be bank notes." You see what's going on here? So it's no longer a bank note, it's a government note. And the government note is basically you. You see, the government is disposed of you. They've decided to make you the collateral. That's why your name, this is ingeniously evil. That's why they had the birth certificate, folks. You see, it's why, your mother assigns you away. It's so important for you to understand that what you're doing is you're putting your children into slavery. You keep following the same old thing. This is why man never moves upward, spiritually or physically. In fact, we're going this way, downward. The powers vested in the Federal Reserve Board seem to be highly dangerous, especially where there is political control of the board. I should be sorry to hold stock in a bank subject to such domination. The bill as it stands seems to me to open the way to a vast inflation of the currency. Of course it is. There is no necessity of dwelling upon this point after the remarkable and most powerful argument of the senior senator from New York. I can be content here to follow the example of the English candidate for Parliament who thought it enough to say ditto to Mr. Burt. I will merely add that I do not like to think that any law can be passed which will make it possible to submerge the gold standard in a flood of irredeemable paper currency. I'd hope to support this bill, but I cannot vote for it as it stands because it seems to me to contain features and to rest upon principles in the highest degree menacing to our prosperity, to stability in business, and to the general welfare of the people of the United States. In 18 years that had passed since Senator Lodge wrote that letter, a warning all the predictions had come true. The government is in banking business as never before. Against its will, it has been made the backer of horse thieves and card sharps, bootleggers, smugglers, speculators, and swindlers in all parts of the world. Throughout the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve Bank, the riffraff of every country is operating on the public credit of the United States government. Meanwhile, that's why the United States is at the critical point it is now. I think it's only 54% of now. This is how destructive it's become. The dollar is on its way out, and I don't know what's going to happen between that euro or the Chinese yuan, but the dollar is on the way out. The great American post-World War II growth after World War II, that's going to cease. We are headed to what I would call third world status here. And you can see it all around you, folks. Look around. It's the corruption is so bad here that we're in the same boat as the Mexicans are already, because nothing is being repaired or built. Have you noticed that bridges are, falling apart? Your infrastructure here is, even though the administrations before this have promised such and such money, such and such. Well, wait a minute. I think it's going all in their pockets, folks. It's not being built. If it is, it's only a token. Meanwhile, and on account of it, we ourselves are in the midst of the greatest depression we have ever known. Yes, they did that too, folks. This was all rigged. Let me find my place here. Sorry about that. Recently, in one of our states, 60,000 dwelling houses and farms were brought under the hammer in a single day, according to Reverend Father Charles E. Coffin, who had later testified before a committee of the House. 71,000 houses and farms in Oakland County, Michigan, had been sold, and their erstwhile owners dispossessed. Similar occurrences had probably taken place in every county of the United States. Have been driven out of are the basis of the Federal Reserve. They are the victims of the dishonest and unscrupulous Federal Reserve Board and Federal Reserve Bank. When are you going to figure out, folks, that the federal doesn't mean centralized government it's a jointly deal with in cahoots with others. That's what federal means. A joint operation of other countries working the scheme. They are the victims of a dishonest, unscrupulous Federal Reserve Board and Federal Reserve Bank. Their children are the new slaves of the auction block in the revival here in the institution of human slavery. In 1913, before the Senate Banking and Currency Committee, Mr. Alexander Lassington made the following statement. But the whole scheme of the Federal Reserve Bank with its commercial paper basis is a impractical, cumbersome machinery. It's simply a cover to find a way to secure the privilege of issuing money and to evade payment of it as much tax upon circulation as possible. Then control the issue and maintain, and instead of reduce interest rates, it is a system that, if inaugurated, will prove to do this advantage of the few and the detriment of the people of the United States. It will mean continuous shortage of actually money and further extension of credit. When there is a lack of real money, people have to borrow credit to their cause. And they become more and more slaves. A few days before the Federal Reserve Act was passed, Senator Elihu Root denounced the Federal Reserve Bill as an outage on our liberties and made the following prediction. Long before we wake up from our dreams of prosperity through an inflated currency, our goal alone could have kept us from the catastrophe will have vanished and no rate of interest will attempt it to return. In the last 15 years, maybe a little longer, but basically the last 15 years, the countries of Russia, China, India are buying gold as though it is going to be the most valuable thing in the world. They're buying it in tons, folks. I doubt there is any significant gold here in the United States anymore. I believe that probably these scoundrels, as we call lawyers or quote unquote senators, have stolen most of it or sold it. If ever a prophecy came true, that one did. It was impossible, however, for those luminous and instructable tinkers to come control the cause of event. On December 23rd, 1913, the Federal Reserve Bill became law. And that night, Colonel House wrote to his hidden master in Wall Street as follows. So you hear me now? This was the night. This was done at night. December 23rd, 1913. They did it in the darkness because their ideas are evil. They sought to steal. They hid it from the public, you see, with a small quorum. I want to say a word of preaching. And when I say quorum, probably we don't have any votes. We don't have who even voted for this or who was even there, you see. It probably was just simply passed. I want to say a word of appreciation to you from the silent, but no doubt effective work you have done in the interest of currency legislation, and to congratulate you that the measure has finally been enacted into law. We all know that an entirely perfect bill, satisfaction to everybody, would have been an impossibility. And I feel quite certain that unless the president had stood as firm as he did, we should likely have no legislation at all. The bill is a good one in many respects, anyhow, good enough to start with and to let experience teach us in what direction it needs perfection, which in the due time we shall then get. In any event, you have personally good reason to feel gratified with what has been accomplished. So the words, unless the president stood as firm as he did, we should likely have no legislation at all, were a gentle reminder that it was Colonel House himself, the holy monk, who had kept the president firm. So either he was pressurized or whatever to continue to support this in public. The foregoing letter affords striking evidence of the manner in which the predator interest in sought to control the government of the United States by surrounding the executive with personality and the influence of a financial Judas. left to itself and to the conduct of his own legislative functions without pressure from the executive, the Congress would not have passed the Federal Reserve Act, according to Congressional House. And since this was his report to his master, we may believe it to be true. The Federal Reserve Act was passed because Wilson stood firm. In other words, because Wilson was under the guidance and control of the most ferocious usury in New York through their hireling named House. The Federal Reserve Act became law the day before Christmas Eve in the year 1913. And shortly afterwards, the German International Bank, Kuhn, Lowe and Company sent out their partners here to run it. In 1913, when the Federal Reserve Bill was submitted to the Democratic caucus, there was a discussion in regard to the form the proposed paper currency should take. The proponents of the Federal Reserve Act and their determination to create a new kind of paper money had not needed to go outside of the Aldrich Bill for a model. By the terms of the Aldrich Bill, banknotes were to be issued by the National Reserve Association and were to be secured partly by gold or lawful money and partly by circulating evidence of debt. You hear that? The first draft of the Federal Reserve Bill presented the same general plan that is for banknotes as opposed to government notes, but with certain differences of regulation. With the provision for the issuance of Federal Reserve notes were placed before President Wilson, he approved of it, but other Democrats were more mindful of democratic principles and great protests greeted the plan. Foremost among those who announced it was William Jennings Bryan, the Secretary of State. Bryant wished to have the Federal Reserve notes issued as government obligations. President Wilson had an interview with him and found him adamant. At the conclusion of the interview, Bryan left with the understanding that he would resign if the notes were made banknotes. Okay, follow me. The president then sent for his secretary and explained the matter to him. Mr. Tourmaline went to see Bryant, and Bryant took from his library shelves a book containing all the Democratic platform and read its extracts from them bearing on the matter of the public currency. Returning it to the president, Mr. Tourmaline told him what had happened and ventured the opinion that Mr. Bryant was right and that Mr. Wilson was wrong. The president then asked Mr. Tourmaline to show him where the Democratic Party and the national platform had ever taken the view indicated by Bryant. Mr. Tourmaline gave him the book, which he had brought from Bryant's house, and the president read very carefully plank after plank on the currency. He then said, I am convinced there is a great deal in what Mr. Bryant says. And thereupon it was arranged that Mr. Tourmaline would see the proponents of the Federal Reserve Bill in efforts to bring about an adjustment of the matter. The remainder of the story may be told in the words of Senator Glass. This is Stegall and Glass, if you know what that is about. They eventually later on proposed to prevent the investment banking and what we would call regular banking not to be together, Glass-Steagall bill, which that was also in the 1990s was eliminated in the Clinton administration. It was rejected. It was law for so many years, and then it was thrown out. And that's why you see the banking industry is such a joke, because now it's a free-for-all because they just invest in anything. It's all speculative. So the plan of allowing the proposed Federal Reserve notes to take the form of banknotes in the manner in which President Wilson and the proponents of the Federal Reserve Bill yielded to Bryant in return for his support of the measure. Senator Glass makes the following statement. The only other feature of the currency bill around which a conflict raged at this time was the note issue provision. Long before I knew it, the president told him the bank notes should be issued by the banks and not by the government. But some of his advisors told him Mr. Bryant could not be induced to give his support to any bill that did not provide for a government note. There was in the Senate and House a large Bryant following, which, united with a natural adversity party vote, could prevent legislation. So, in other words, William Jennings Bryan had a whole lot of clout with him, and so you have to understand the power he had trying to override this or deal with this. Certain overconfident gentlemen profited their services in the task of managing Bryant. They did not budge him. When a decision could no longer, what's the word at here, be postponed, the president summoned me to the White House to say he wanted Federal Reserve notes to be obligations of the United States. I was for an instant speechless. With all the earnestness of my being, I demonstrated pointing out the unscientific nature of such a thing. You know, they chose a man who basically didn't know shit about anything. He was a pauper. Wilson was one of the worst presidents this country's ever known. I thought that Franklin Roosevelt was bad, which Franklin Roosevelt is bad. But Wilson set the whole agenda by basically making it possible for Franklin Roosevelt to do what he did later on. So it would be a pretense on his face. Was there ever a government note based primarily on the property of banking institutions? Was there ever a bank that suggested government obligation is so remote it would never be discerned? I concluded, out of breath. Exactly so, Glass, earnestly said the president. Every word you say is true. The government liability is a mere thought. And so if we can hold to the substance of the thing and give the other fellows the shadow, why not do it, if thereby we may save our bill? It's amazing. Anyway, won't go into there. Shadow and substance. So basically they're going to try to fake these guys out. They're going to fake them out. That's what they're doing. One can see from this how little President Wilson knew about banking. Unknowingly, he gave the substance to the international bankers and the shadow to the common man. Thus was Bryant circumventing in his efforts to uphold the democratic doctrine of the rights of the people. Thus, the unscientifically blur upon the bill was perpetrated. The unscientific blur, however, was not the fact that the United States government, by the name of Bryant Edict, was obligated, obliged to assume as an obligation whatever currency was being issued. Mr. Bryant was right when he insisted that the United States should preserve its sovereignty over the public currency. The unscientific blur was the nature of the currency itself, a nature which makes it unfit to be assumed as an obligation of the United States government. This is paper. It's debts. That's what the note is. It's a debt. When the proponents of the act saw that the Democratic docket would not permit them to let the proposed bank issue the new currency as banknotes, they should have stopped at that. They should not have fostered that kind of currency, namely an asset currency, on the United States government. They should have not have made the government liable on the private debts of individual and corporations, at least of all on the private debts of foreigners. This is how sick this is. The Federal Reserve note is essentially unsound. As Kimmerer says, the Federal Reserve notes, therefore, is in form have some of the qualities of government paper money, but in substance are almost a pure asset currency possessing a government guarantee against which contingency the government has made no provision whatsoever. Honorable E.J. Hill, a former member of the House, said, truly, they are obligations of the government for which the United States has received nothing, and for the payment of which at any time it assumes the responsibility looking to the Federal Reserve to recoup itself. If the United States government is to redeem the Federal Reserve notes when the general public finds out what it costs us to deliver this flood of paper money to the 12 Federal Reserve banks, and the government has made no provision for redeeming them, the first element of unsoundness is not far to seek. Before the Banking and Currency Committee, when the Federal Reserve Bill was under discussion, Mr. Krosler of Cincinnati stated, in other words, the imperial power of elasticity of the public currency is wielded exclusively by these central corporations owned by the bank. This is a life and death power over all local banks and all businesses. It can be used to create or destroy prosperity. Of course it can. To ward off or cause sentiments and panics by making money artificially scarce. Interest rates throughout the country can be arbitrarily raised and the bank tax on all business and cost of living increased for the benefit to the people. These 12 corporations together cover the whole country and monopolies and use for the private gain every dollar of the public currency and all public revenue of the United States. Not a dollar can be put into circulation among the people by their government without the consent of and no terms fixed by these 12 private money trusts. In defiance of this and all other warnings, the proponents of the Federal Reserve Act created the 12 private credit corporations and gave them absolutely monopoly over the currency of the United States. Not of the Federal Reserve notes alone, but of all currency. The Federal Reserve Act provided ways by means of which the gold and general currency in the hands of American people could be attained by Federal Reserve banks in exchange for Federal Reserve notes, which are not money, but merely promises to pay money. It's debts. It's all debts. Since the evil day when this was done, the initial monopoly has been extended by vicious amendments to the Federal Reserve Act and by the unlawful and treason practice of the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve banks. So here's the deal. Mr. Chairman, when a Chinese merchant sells human hair to a Paris wig maker and bills him in dollars, the Federal Reserve Bank can buy his bills against the wig maker and then use that bill as collateral for the Federal Reserve notes. The United States government thus pays the Chinese merchant the debt of the wig maker and gets nothing in return except a shady title to the Chinese hair. This is asinine. This is like shooting yourself in the foot many times. Mr. Chairman, if a Scottish distiller wishes to send a cargo of Scottish whiskey to the United States, he can draw his bill against the purchasing bootlegger in dollars. And after the bootlegger has accepted it by writing his name across the face of it, the Scotch distiller can send that bill to the nefarious open discount market in New York City, where the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve banks will buy it and use it as collateral for a new issue of Federal Reserve notes. Thus, the government of the United States pays the Scottish distiller for the Federal Reserve banks. For the whiskey. Start over. The United States pays the Scottish distiller for the whiskey before it is even shipped. And if it is lost on the way, or if the Coast Guard seizes and destroys it, the Federal Reserve banks simply write off the loss, and the government never receives the money and was paid to the Federal Reserve banks. Are financing the distiller business in Europe and paying bootleggers bills with public credit of the United States government. Now, let me explain to you what's going on here, folks. U.S. government is going to take you and charge you the bill. Do you follow? That's what happens. They made us the collateral. We're slaves to the system. Another example, Mr. Chairman, if a German brewer ships beer to this country or anywhere else in the world and draws his bill for it in dollars, the Federal Reserve banks will buy that bill and use it as collateral for Federal Reserve notes. See how this has happened in the past here? Thus, they compel our government to pay the German brewer for his beer. Why should the Federal Reserve? Why should the government pay for that? They don't get it. Why should the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve banks be permitted to finance the brewing industry in Germany, either in this way or as they do by compelling small and fearful United States banks to take stock in Eisenbeck Brewery and in the German Bank for Brewing Industry? Mr. Chairman, if Dynamite Nobel wishes to sell dynamite to Japan to use in Manchuria or elsewhere, it can draw up its bill against the Japanese customers in dollars and send that bill to the nefarious open discount market in New York City, where the Federal Reserve Board and the banks will buy it and use its collateral for a new issue of Federal Reserve notes. Do you understand what's going on here, folks? So, while at the same time the Federal Reserve Board will be helping Dynamite Nobel by stuffing his stock into the U.S. banking system. Why should we send our representatives to the disarmament conference in Geneva while the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve banks are making our government pay Japanese debts to the German munitional makers? It goes on and on here, folks. It's unbelievable. I'm going to have to stop. It's getting late, and I'm pretty pooped. So we'll do this another time, and we'll start at that point in this. My point simply is for you to understand how you've been done, how you've been treated. Why would you want to be a citizen of this country? Why would you want to be a subject? Because that's what the word citizen means. Citizen means subject, folks. You're a subject. And there are people out there, repeat, there are people out there who are fighting for the system. Mainly most, Republicans fighting against Democrats, such and such. And the ship is sinking, folks. It's as simple as that. And yet people are so gullible these days. They're not even thinking. Look around you. Look around you. In my lifetime, since I was born in 1960, this country has gone to hell in a handbasket, folks, because of people who profit off of others. You see? And rightfully so, the young people, I'm thinking about the days when Obama was in power. And you remember the 1% thing. Well, it is the 1%, but the problem simply is they were misled in certain ways. The problem is simply is foreign investors and bankers who are destroying, and our government allowed it to destroy their own country from within. So, okay. We'll let you go. You have a good night. You take care. And we'll talk to you another time. Thank you.